Hey everybody, it's Jason. Welcome back to the Mosaic Church Podcast. At the end of this podcast, please take a moment to connect with us on social media. It's a great place to learn more and to see what's happening at Mosaic. Most importantly, hope the following message encourages and inspires you to take a new step on your faith journey. Enjoy.
How's everybody doing? Good. I know Joe started us out with that. That was a much better response. It seems like maybe we're a little more awake. So that's good. There's no communion today, guys, which means I have made it to a full sermon. And I promise this is the last time you'll hear me make that joke. All right, I hope everybody has been having a good summer. I don't know about for you, but it seems like summer is always a season that happens to go by the fastest. And today we are going to be talking about the longest season. And before you think I'm talking about winter, I'm actually talking about the season of waiting. We have been going through the minor prophets here over the course of this last summer, and today we're going to be in Habakkuk, and there's 3 chapters that cover a lot in a 3-chapter period, but the theme that kept coming back to me was that God is in the waiting. You see a people that are distraught with some of the ick and hard times that are happening, and in the beginning of this passage is crying out like, "How long, O Lord?" And so when we think about God being in the waiting, we know that we can trust his story. And if we can trust his story, then we can trust and know that even in those in-between times, he's there with us. Now, when I was thinking about this a little bit deeper, I started with just thinking about some of my favorite books and movies. And if you think about some of your favorite books and movies, there's usually undoubtedly like a season in that story where an individual finds themselves waiting. Maybe they've hit rock bottom, and so they're waiting for things to turn around. Maybe there's a break in a relationship, and so they're waiting for things to get fixed or for some sort of forgiveness to be extended, or they're just simply stuck. And I don't know about for you, but usually during those parts of the movies or the book, I kind of just want to like fast forward, especially when it's one that I've seen before, because I just want to get to the good part. I want to know that there is redemption, that there is reconciliation, that there is a good ending. And I think sometimes in that middle period, in that waiting period, we often see characters or individuals lash out. Sometimes they become depressed. Sometimes they're even entitled. And as uncomfortable as that middle period is, as Christ followers, we know how the story ends. And because we know how the story ends, because we know that it's good, there is a way that we can go through that season of waiting well. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. Just as we trust God in the waiting, how do we do that well when we don't know his timing? Now, I've been thinking a lot lately about birth, like reflecting back on my son Jedediah's birth, and it's probably because of the current state I'm in, and I know in a few months I'm going to have to go through that period of time again, and that those last hours of waiting, those last moments of anguish, if there's the ladies in the room, or if, husbands, dads too, I know you were there, there's this period of time that's just really uncomfortable, and you're like, how much longer? I remember thinking, like, I can handle one more contraction if I know how many more. How much longer do I have to wait? And yet we don't always get that time frame. And so what do you do when you're in the midst of that waiting? Now, that's just one example in life. I could think of a lot of different examples, but I was reading through a devotional by Jill Briscoe, and she painted it beautifully in giving some examples of some of the ways that we find ourselves to be waiting. And so I'm going to read that. Hi, baby. It's okay. Who or what are we waiting for? A job? A friend? Someone to love you or for you to love back? Are you waiting for a break or a baby? Reconciliation perhaps, or an important prayer to be answered. Maybe you're waiting for the bullying or the betrayal to stop, or the lying, hating, injustice, corruption, or hurt. Perhaps you're in a crisis of faith that needs to be resolved, and God seems far away, and you're saying, "How long, O Lord, must I wait before all these things are realized?" As I previously mentioned, we don't get the timing, but He does meet us where we are at. And there are some real and good life lessons we can learn in that process. Now, the first one I'm going to start with is one that I think is just beneficial in general. It's not just for the season of waiting, but it's a good life practice, I think, just to work through. And that is, what does it look like to be curious? Now, curiosity is something that we're either really good at or we're not. You either find yourself on the I know all things, or you're maybe on the other side of I would like to learn more things. And hopefully we find ourselves somewhere in the middle most of the time. But when we're curious, we get to ask non-leading questions. We get to just simply ask, why is this way? Or who else has experienced something similar? Or, what is this? Why is this happening? And to be genuine in asking that. Because I think sometimes we ask questions, and the reason I said non-leading is because sometimes we ask questions and we really know the answer and we want the other individual to come to that same conclusion. And yet if we leave space for people to actually answer, we actually get to become learners and better listeners. We talk a lot at Hope Street about how are we listening to better understand, as opposed to listening to have a better answer. And I know that can be really hard sometimes. But in that, we can also consider the best in people. And this kind of goes hand in hand with not assuming. And we're in church, and so if you haven't heard the phrase, you can ask somebody after church what happens when you assume. But it's not good. It doesn't benefit us to assume things, because usually we assume the worst. And when you do that, it doesn't set yourself up or the other individual up to succeed or flourish in life. And so the best way that we can be curious is to hold the space. Now, you guys are really great here with understanding the importance of community and showing up for one another. And that is so much of what holding the space is about. It's creating this opportunity for people to feel seen and heard and loved and better understood. It's not necessarily to add your input or figure out what the solution is. It's simply going to be, hey, we're going to show up, and we may ask you some questions, but it's simply because we want to better understand and know you better, and that you can better feel understood and known on a deeper level. And oftentimes, as people are, that's where healing takes place. I find so many times that people actually come to their own best conclusion just simply through being able to have that conversation, and people creating space for that conversation to happen. Now, I have a 2-year-old, which you just heard crying, and I can see straight out. So that's why I'm looking down more than normal. But he is almost 2-year-old, yeah. He's very curious. He wants to know why trucks are so loud. He loves it, but he wants to know why. He wants to know if dirt tastes good, and I think he thinks it does. I don't. But there's so many things that he's curious about at this point in life, and he believes that his mom and dad at this stage have the answers. And I know that someday that will change. We'll probably think the exact opposite. But my hope is that when he finds himself there in that season, that he knows that there is a God and a Father in heaven who does have all the answers and who welcomes our curiosity. We see that in this first chapter in Habakkuk. There's this back and forth dialogue, and it's, how long, O Lord? Or do you see what's happening? Do you know what they're doing? And then the Lord is responding. He's engaging. He's allowing space for Habakkuk to express, this is what is difficult. This is what we're seeing. And this is what we hope for. Are you able to hold the space and create opportunities for people, yourself included, most importantly, to be curious about why you're in the waiting, or what the waiting is meant to bring about in your life? What is the purpose behind it? Now, second is be courageous. Now, I was thinking through this at first, and I kind of got annoyed with myself because they are all three going to be C's, and I don't always do that. But what does it look like to be courageous? And I think, we just finished watching maybe the Olympics, and you see athletes that have great courage, they've trained a lot, and they're accomplishing great odds, many overcoming injuries and setbacks and things. And life is full of that. And when you're in the waiting, sometimes it feels like you're at a standstill and nothing's moving. And so it's kind of interesting to think about what does it look like to be courageous when things seem to be at a standstill? And I think the biggest thing in that is that we can be courageous in trusting our Father. We can be courageous in knowing that our faith is actually most tested when we can't see. That's actually the very definition of what that means. So when you can't see where things are going to end or when things are going to get better, are you still courageous in your faith? Are you still seeking His word? Are you still praying? Are you still in community? Are you seeking others' guidance? Or are you simply slowly but surely shrinking back and isolating? Now, as we're courageous, we can really have this I'm going to stay the course. I know what I have been doing. I'm seeking the Lord. I feel like I'm still within His will, and so I'm going to just pause and wait here. And sometimes that waiting includes a really intentional and important season of rest and restoration. Sometimes that season just means hey, there might be some things you need to learn until you figure it out. We're going to wait right here. I've been there. It's not comfortable. It's not fun, but it's necessary. And our Father is so gracious in knowing exactly what it is that we need in those seasons. But if we try to internalize and go to ourselves, or we try to find other coping mechanisms, we may be stuck there a lot longer than we would have to be. Now, in Habakkuk, in the first chapter, verse 5, I'm going to read a couple of verses that kind of hint on this. So it says, "Look at the nations and watch, and be utterly amazed, for I'm going to do something in your days that you would not believe, even if you were told." And then later in chapter 3, verse 2, it says, "Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds, O Lord. Renew them in our day and our time, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy." So I know the last couple of times I spoke, I talked a lot about how when we're rooted in His word and we're reflecting on His word, we can recall that in the moments when we need it most. And in the moments when we don't think we need it, it's still there. And it's living and active, and it's transforming us from the inside out, and it equips us and prepares us for these seasons when we don't want to be courageous, or it feels really hard to be courageous because we'd rather just sit and sulk and ask why. Now, last point here is to be content. And I was thinking about this, and I looked up the definition, and the first definition that I found was the state of pure happiness. And I was I don't really like that. When I think about happiness, I think of just it's a very fleeting thing. It's usually dependent upon a circumstance or what's going on around you, and it's a feeling. And feelings come and go, right? And so when I think about contentment, I feel it's a byproduct of God's grace. It's a gift from Him. It's something that we receive and we can live inside of when we receive His daily grace, which empowers us to be at peace and to experience His joy. And we know that peace and joy are both things, God's peace and joy are both things that surpass our understanding. You probably know it, the difference when you've experienced it. There's something that just settles. I was recently listening to one of my friends. We were interviewing for a video that we're doing for Hope Street, and she talked about how she knows when she's experiencing God's peace. And she said, "I feel like it's this deep breath that's this God breath that just cleanses me, and I know that wow, I feel, can't explain it, but there's just this I'm breathing as I'm supposed to be breathing." And I thought that was so beautiful because I think that that's what content is. And it doesn't mean that things have gotten better. It doesn't mean that you're not still in that waiting season, or you're not still wondering how much longer, oh Lord. But in the midst of those questions and that curiosity, you're still holding true to who He is. And that's how we can get up each and every single day and still join Him in His will. We can still be Christ followers that still reflect his love, his grace, his truth, all of those things to a hurting world, even when we're hurting ourselves. Now, as we're content, I believe in the parentheses I put under there, I said, yet vigilant. And that vigilant part for me, it was really just, we're called to still be expectant. So we can be content in the season where we're at, but I don't think that means that God calls us to just be like stuck there. It's like, hey, no, I'm going to equip you and I'm going to empower you to have everything that you need to be at peace and to experience my joy. But part of that peace and that joy comes from knowing that you have a hope. And the hope is that that story that I've written is good. It ends well and it includes you. So as we're content, we can also find peace and joy in knowing that we can still be expectant for what is to come. Back into this chapter, into this book here, we have in chapter 2, verse 3, it says, "For the revelation awaits an appointed time. It speaks of the end and will not prove false. Though it linger, wait for it. It will certainly come and it will not delay." And I love that part, it will not delay, right? Like we are so used to having things like when we want them, and a lot of things in our life now make it possible for us to get things as quickly as we want. I still am baffled every time I get something the same day from Amazon. I live in the middle of nowhere. And yet that's created this habit inside of me that's like, no, I should be able to get things when I want to get them. I don't want to wait. And yet we know that the waiting is necessary, and we know that the waiting still produces a good ending because our Father is faithful. And in chapter 3, verse 6, it says, his ways are eternal. So again, just going back to like, our perspective is so limited. No matter how intelligent you are, no matter how much life experience you have, our perspective is still not his, and his is eternal. And so the beautiful thing is that we get to have this relationship with the one who is eternal, who knows the end, who knows the whole process along the way, and wants to comfort us in that process. Now, when we practice those three things I just mentioned, to be curious, to be courageous, and to be content, we can begin to see our hearts be soft. And as our hearts are soft, they're also humble. And humble and soft hearts are able to be comforted and conformed by him. But these are still, it's your choice. You can go through the waiting periods kicking and screaming and angry and bitter and isolated. You're like, he gives us those choices. And yet he also provides a choice and an opportunity to do that differently. And so when you find yourselves angry and bitter and entitled, my guess is that your hearts become a little bit hardened. And so it's asking yourself, what is the posture of my heart? And how do I begin to move the needle in the direction it needs to go? Now, in the beginning of this book, I read this over several times. I kept being like, okay. After I changed this, guys, a couple of days ago, this whole entire message, and then it finally sunk in. And the thing that sunk in most for me was this chapter. This book begins with, "How long, O Lord, must I call for you? Call for help, but you do not listen, or cry out to you. Violence, but you do not save." And then it ends with, "The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes my feet like the feet of deer. He enables me to go on the heights." And I must admit, I was actually in my garage cleaning, and I have a little plaque by the sink, and I looked up, and it's that very verse, and I was like, oh, I didn't even realize, I didn't make the connection that was in the same book. And so then when I went back and I noticed he starts in this curious, unsure, wanting things to be different, and then it ends with almost this, but even so, this is what is true of you. And so as we wrestle and vacillate back and forth between what our current life circumstances may look like and what we hope they soon will look like, we can still trust that God is consistent. He hasn't changed. He's still true. He's still present. He still sees you. He can see you in your mess and in your muck where you're at and still see you down the road, complete and good in the end. Now, there's never a better example than Jesus when it comes to how do we actually do this? What does this look like? And if you go to the Garden of Gethsemane, And you see Jesus is in this moment where he is in major distress. There's some translations that literally say like he was sweating blood. So he was very distraught. And yet he was saying in that moment, Lord, I know he knew what had to happen. He's like, I want this cup to pass, but if it has to happen this way, Lord, your will, not my will, be done. And so he was curious in that moment about a way out, even though he knew there wasn't, and yet he was still willing to enter in because of the greater will that he wanted to have come to fruition. We see as Jesus is captured, and I know you know this story, bring it to the day where he's climbing up to Golgotha, and he's got a cross on his back, and we see him taking one courageous step after the next. And I don't know about you, but I read that story, and you can see there's movies that depict that very moment, and I can't help but imagine that people weren't still encouraged. That this man, that many, some were very threatened by, and others had been following, had been healed by, had seen the miracles. They wanted the story to end differently, and yet they still saw this man that was willing to carry this cross up to his end. And we obviously know how that story ends, and we know some of Jesus' last words before that moment ends is, "It is finished." And as I was rethinking through that, I was like, I think that was the moment that we see Jesus was content. There was still a peace and a joy, even though there was this wow, there's this deep burden and thing that he has to carry on our behalf, and yet he knew that the ending was still good. Now, as we think about the season that we're in right now, maybe some of you guys are in a season where you feel like you're waiting for things to change and things just can't seem to change quick enough. Maybe you're waiting for a loved one to turn something around and come home or say sorry. Maybe you're waiting for your next break. You're wondering when's the next thing that I get to do or be a part of? You have these desires and they're not yet being lived out. God sees you and he knows your heart. And my hope is that this morning that we realize that in our season of waiting, if it's not pushing us into community, if you find yourself more in isolation, wrestling with your own thoughts, angry, worried, all of those things, consider whether or not, some of these things that we talked about today would help you begin to shift your perspective, would help you begin to go back to the one whose story is always good, whose story we can trust. And if you find yourself in that isolation, trusting and knowing that there's actually a different way we can spend that season of waiting. In our season of waiting, we can actually know God better. We can know ourselves better, and we can understand other people. I think about, testimonies, and when people share their stories it's often the season of the waiting, right? Or the season where God was waiting on us because we were just doing our own thing. That becomes the biggest part that draws other people to him. And so I tell you that to take courage in knowing that it's not wasted. And even if your story doesn't come out to be the way that you hoped it to be, I think oftentimes we think okay, if I knew how much longer I had to wait, kind of going back to birth, right? If I knew how much longer I had to wait until I could hold my new baby, I'd be okay. Or at least I think I'd be okay. But we don't get that time. And I think the other thing is sometimes people think, well, I would be okay with waiting if I knew that after I waited, the thing that I got on the other end was good. And by good, if we're honest, we mean the thing that we really want. And what God promises us is that it will be good because it'll be exactly what we need. And so we get to trust him and his provision and his care and his all-knowing knowledge of what is actually best for us. And so kind of going back to that again, we get to know God better, we get to know ourselves better, and we get to understand other people. And that just makes us more empathetic. It creates this opportunity for us to be in community, and when people are going through different seasons, we can meet people where they're at, and we can pause, and we can hold the space, and we can create opportunities for people to feel seen and heard and loved, but not stuck Because as we do that, movement naturally happens. And God wants us to be continually reformed and transformed into his likeness together. To be reflections, so when you go across the street and you're at the football game and you get to interact with a bunch of high schoolers high school's a hard stage, and it's just even harder, I feel like, in this day and age. And yet you get to reflect that, like, hey, I see you. You get to pause long enough to ask, how are you doing? And you get to love and serve. What better way than, nobody wants to clean up after there's been a festival. You probably want to be the ones that go to the football game too, but what better way to show, hey, I get to love you all where you're at in this season and trust that there is a good God who has a good story to tell. Now, I intentionally, which is kind of ironic because I joked about in the beginning that I got more time today, and I'm not actually going to use all of the time because I wanted to create some time afterwards. For those of you, I'll be up front, and I don't know if Jason and Michelle, if those others, leaders that are here, I want to just be intentional and not overlook or simplify the season that you may find yourself in. I purposely am not talking about it because even just reflecting back on it feels painful, but there's seasons in my own life where the waiting was horrible, really painful. And so I don't want to ignore that may be where you're at. And so if there's somebody that you would like to talk to, I'd be happy to hold the space with you and pray with you and just take a moment to pause. And so I really wanted to create an intentional time just to allow for that if that's where you find yourself at today. We can encourage each other and point each other to truth and how to live this life well, and also be mindful of when we're in that moment. Sometimes the last thing we want to hear is another you got it, you can do it, this is how we're going to do it. And yet it's still important to talk about it. Now, as you find moments kind of over the next week to just reflect, I want this one phrase to kind of be the thing you kind of take with you. And that's, we can trust his story. And I just want you to think about that. That may mean different things for each of you. If you are wrestling with the part that's what does it mean to trust, or what does it mean that what's his story? I want you to think through that, but I want you to figure out what part you're wrestling with, and find somebody else that's here, whether you're with a family member or a friend, or you want to come back. I'll be back again at some point. I don't know the next time I'm here, but I'd be happy to talk through that more with you. But I think that's just so crucial and key, especially right now, when you even think about just the state of our country and all the things that are going on. It can feel like a time where we're all waiting for what's going to happen. And we just really need to be able to hold to the hope that we have, and trusting his story is good, and he is a faithful God, and everything all ends well, ultimately. We don't know when, we don't know how, but we do know that it will be good.
Once again, thank you so much for listening. If you live in Southeast Wisconsin, we would love to connect with you at our weekend gathering. For service time, directions, and to learn more about our vision to ignite a movement of love that transforms our community and the world, visit us at mosaicwi.com.